Hi guys, I'm Anita and I'm back with another video, and today I wanted to do my 2018 reading statistics video. This is the video where I talk about a little bit in depth about the type of reading that I've been doing over the last year and how many books, how many pages, what the genres were and all of that good stuff, because I am a bit of a geek when it comes to statistics and stuff. So yeah, I'm gonna do it the way that I always do it. I'm gonna start out by telling you all about the statistics part, and then I'm gonna end the video by telling you all the books that I read in 2018, so you can get an overview of the books and what I rated them if you want to. If you want to know about my favorite books of the year, I have a video up already. I'll get that up here as well in the description box below, so you can find it and watch it if you want to. First up, I'm starting with the Goodreads stats, those things that Goodreads tracks in the reading challenge of the year. First up, I read a total of 150 books according to Goodreads, spanning over 48,137 pages, which averages to about 320 pages per book. The shortest book that I read over the year was First Frost by Jennifer Estep. This one is 30 pages and is a prequel novella set in the Mythos Academy series, so it's only 30 pages. Yeah. The largest book on my list is not that surprisingly The Stand by Stephen King, which comes at 1153 on Goodreads, the edition that I read from, but my edition I have here is actually 1300 pages long. So yeah, this is larger. The most popular book that I read in 2018 was Animal Farm by George Orwell. I don't remember the exact number of people who've read it, but I mean, it's a classic type of dystopian book, so it's not surprising to me that it's been read by so many people, and it's really short as well. And the least popular book was Speed Reading, a guide. Something about a guide. I've unhauled it. I forgot the actual title. It's really long and it's terrible. So I don't recommend reading it. Yeah, there's no point. Anyway, my average rating of the year has been a 3.6, and my Goodreads total over all of the time that I've been on Goodreads is 3.9. So I've definitely become a lot grumpier over the past year. So that is a thing. But I am also a lot more critical now than I was in the beginning of my Goodreads reading experience. And finally, the highest rated book on Goodreads that I read this year was Wildfire by ILONA Andrews, the third and final book in the Hidden Legacy series, and this has an average rating of 4.56 on Goodreads, and I definitely agree it's a really good book, so I highly recommend you read that series. I personally rated it 5 out of 5 stars. Now, if you look into more detailed statistics, which all of these next statistics I've got from the spreadsheet that is created by Brock from Let's Read. I'll leave a link to the new spreadsheet for 2019 down below if you want to start tracking your reading for 2019, as well as a link to his Twitter account, because that's where he announced the spreadsheet this year. I don't think he's as active on BookTube any longer as he used to be. Anyway, in terms of genre, I read, not surprisingly, majority of the books that I read was fantasy. I read 40% fantasy, and I read 17% that was sci-fi, and then I read 14% that was contemporary, and then I read 7.5% that was urban fantasy. Then I read a few classics and a few historical fictions, and horror should also be about 6%, I think. I didn't write it down, I don't know why. Anyway, sorry, you can see the overall graph here, hopefully. I'm gonna attempt putting it on here at least. In the terms of formatting, if you've been on my channel for a while, you know that I'm a big audio person, so yeah, not surprisingly, almost half of my reading was in audio form, 48% to be exact, and I read about 16.4% that was graphic novels, 14% were trade paperbacks, almost 10% were hardbacks, and the equal amount of ebooks, and last and finally, 2.7% were mass markets, so I don't read a lot of mass market paperbacks. The average books per month that I read over the year was about 12 books, and the average page count per month was 3,975 pages. which equals to about 128 pages per day. In terms of page length, their stats goes as follows. I read 5 books that was less than 100 pages long. I read 29 books between 100 and 199. I read 28 books that was between 200 and 299. And then I read 45 books that was between 300 and 399 pages. Then I have 27 books that was between 400 and 499 pages. I read 11 books that was between 500 and 599 pages. I read 2 books between 600 and 699 pages. And I read 1 book between 800 and 899 pages. And then I read 1 book that was surpassed 1,000 pages. In terms of publication year, I read 1 book that was published in the 40s. I read 3 books that was published before the 20s. I read 6 books published in the 70s, 8 books published in the 80s, 7 books published in the 90s, 19 books published in the 2000s era, like between 2000 and 2009. And I read 85 books that was between 2010 and 2017. And the last and final 18 books that I read in 2018 was released in 2018. Yeah. In terms of where I've gotten my reading from, 40% of my reading came from Storytel, which is an audio service that I use that is reminding me a little bit of Scribd. That is very popular at the moment, except I have access to all the books no matter how many I read a month. 22% of my books were from the library, 8% was from Amazon, 8% was from the Kindle store, 7% was from Audible, 4% was from Humble Bundle, 4% was from the Book Depository, 3% was from awesomebooks.com, and 2% was from Amazon Marketplace, and the last and final 1% was from BogID, which is a Danish bookstore. In terms of rating, my ratings goes as follows. I gave 10 books 2 stars, I gave 3 books 2.5 stars, I gave 27 books 3 stars, I gave 24 books 3.5 stars, I gave 54 books 4 stars, and I gave 8 books 4.5 stars, and finally I gave 25 stars. In terms of author gender, I read 58 books from male authors, 83 books from female authors, and I read 4 books that was from both, and then I read 1 book that was from an unknown. So yeah, not surprisingly to me, the majority of the books that I read was from women, but and a lot of the male authors that I read are the same, so yes. In 2018 I read 99 books that was a serious book, and I read 44 standalones. Out of those 99 serious books, I advanced in 49 series, or caught up to them, and I completed 7 series, and I started 43 new ones, so good thing that I have my focus on reading a lot more serious books this year, and serious next books, not beginning of a serious books. Last and finally, I decided to take a look at which author I've read the most from over the past year. And to me it's not surprising, but the one that comes in on the first spot is Stephen King with 7 books, and I have my Stephen King project, so I was not surprised to see that he was at the top of the list. And not surprisingly, Terry Pratchett is the second one on the list, as I read 5 books from him. And then comes Robin Hobb, who has read 4 books by. And then I also have, on 4 books, I also have Natsuki Takaya, where I've read the four volumes in the Fruits Basket, and Peter Madsen, where I've read the 4 volumes in the collected saga, Valhalla Collected Saga. However, that is also exactly 12 volumes collected in 4 books, or volumes, whatever you want to call it. But I count the other 3 authors above these 2 because they're graphic novels and they don't take as much time and effort to read them. So yeah, those are the actual stats for the past year. Now let's get into the books from start to finish. The books that I've read over the 2018. I hope you enjoy. The first book that I read in 2018 was Rage by Richard Bachman, also known as Stephen King. I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read Geekerella by Ashley Poston, a Cinderella retelling that I gave 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read Theft of Swords by Michael J. Sullivan, the first book bind up of the first 2 books in the Revelation series. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Crimson Frost by Jennifer Estep, the 4th book in the Mythos Academy series. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. Next thing I read was Year One by Nora Roberts, the first book in the Chronicles of the One. I rated this one 3.5 stars. Then I read The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. This is a debut standalone novel, and I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. The next one I read was Guards by Terry Pratchett, the 8th book set in the Discworld and the first book set in the City Watch series. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. Next up I read The Walking Dead Volume 2 by Robert Kirkman and Charlie Adlard. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Animal Farm by George Orwell. This is a classic, as I said before, and I gave this one 3.5 stars. The next one I read was River of Teeth by Sarah Gailey, the first book in the River of Teeth duology. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next up I read Dragon Keeper by Robin Hobb, the first book in the Rainwild Chronicles. This is the 4th series set in the realm of the Elderlings. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next up I read Artemis by Andy Weir. This is one of my most disappointing books of the year. I gave this one 2.5 stars. Next up I read Beneath the Sugar Sky by Shauna Maguire. This I gave 3.5 stars. Next up I read Attachments by Rainbow Rowell. This is a standalone and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Next up I read A Man Called Ove by Frederick Bachman. This I also gave 4 out of 5 stars. Next up I read The Hanging Girl by Eileen Cook. I also gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Through the Woods by Emily Carroll. This is a graphic novel and anthology-like short story collection, and I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read All Systems Red by Martha Wells, the first book in the Murderbot Diaries. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next up I read Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. This is the first book in the Strange the Dreamer duology, I think. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Next up I read Fruits Basket Volume 2 by Natsuki Takaya. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next up I read Nevermore, The Trials of Morgan Crow by Jessica Townsend. This is the first book in the Nevermore series. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. Next I read Ting min søn skal vide om verden, or Things My Son Needs to Know About the World by Frederick Bachman. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Prince of Mist by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. This is the first book in the trilogy, which I've currently forgotten what it's called. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Born by Jeff Vandermeer. This is a standalone book and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Next up I read Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, and this is also a classic standalone, and I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was The Stand by Stephen King. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next up I read Five Daughters of the Moon by Lena Likitalo. This is the first book in the Waning Moon duology. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Next up I read So You Want to Be a Wizard by Diane Duane. This is the first book in the Young Wizard series, and I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Sending Ascents by Josiah Bancroft. This is the first book in the Tower of Babel trilogy, or something like that. I forgot the name of the series. Then I read Eric by Terry Pratchett, a short story in the Rincewind series. This is the 9th book set in the Discworld, and it is the, I want to say, 4th book set in the Rincewind series. Next up I read Monstrous Volume 2 by Marjorie Amelue and Sana Takeda. This is the second volume, obviously, in a series, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Next up I read The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden, the first book in the Winter Night trilogy. I gave this one 4.5 stars. Then I read Red Sister by Mark Lawrence, the first book in the Book of the Ancestors series. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next up I read The Creakers by Tom Fletcher. This is a children's book, and I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read Skin Games by Jim Butcher. This is the 15th book set in the Dresden Files universe. Next up I read Fruits Basket Volume 3 by Natsuki Takaya. Next up, I read Sleeping Giants by Sylvain Neville. This is the first book in the Themis Files, and I gave this one 3.5 stars. Then I read Binti by Nnedi Okorafor, the first book in the Binti trilogy. I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. This is the first book in a series, and I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read Wheel of the Infinite by Martha Wells. I also gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read American Panda by Gloria Chow. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read Everyone's an Alien When You're an Alien Too by Jomni Sun. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Vejen til Pantheon by Boris Hansen. This is the first book in a trilogy, and this is a Danish fantasy book. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Then I read Valhalla, Den Samlede Saga, or The Collected Saga by Peter Madsen, the first in the Valhalla series. This I gave 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Our Dark Dyrt by V.E. Schwab or Victoria Schwab. This is the second and final book in the Monsters of Verity duology. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Then I read The Full Metal Alchemist Volume 4 by Hiromu Arakawa. I gave this one 4.5 stars. Then I read The Ship of the Dead by Rick Riordan, the third and final book in the Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard series. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Next up, I read Waking Gods by Sylvain Neville. This is the second book in the Themis Files series. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Next up, I read A Trail Through Time by Jodie Taylor. This is the fourth book set in the Chronicles of St. Mary series. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. I didn't like this one, and I gave it 2 stars. Next up, I read Moving Pictures by Terry Pratchett. This is the first book set in the Industrial Revolution series, but it's the 10th book set in the Discworld. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Next up, I read Descender Volume 3 by Jeff Lemire and Dustin Nguyen. I gave this one 4.5 stars. No, 4 stars. Next up, I read another graphic novel, another saga, Volume 7. This is by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Rusty Nail by Alice Clayton, the second book in the Cocktail series. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Wedding Night by Sophie Kinsella. This is a standalone, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read Born Wicked by Jessica Spotswood, the first book in the Cahill Witch Chronicles. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read White Hot by Ilona Andrews. This is the second book in the Hidden Legacy series. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Long Walk by Richard Bachman, also known as Stephen King. This I gave 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Hunter, which is a short novella that I don't intend on continuing. I think it's by J.D. Horn. I gave it 3 stars. Then I read The Start of Us by Lauren Oliver. I think I gave this one 2 out of 5 stars. Then I read A Bollywood Affair by Sonali Dev. This is the first book in the Bollywood series. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read Djævelens Lærling or The Devil's Apprentice by Kenneth Bøgh Andersen, the first book in the Great Devil War or Den Store Djævlekrig series. Oh, this is difficult. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi. This is the first book in a series called The Legends of Orisha, I think. And this is debut. I enjoyed it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read Dragon Haven by Robin Hobb, the second book in the Ringwraith Chronicles series. And I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read Malice by John Gwynne, the first book in the Faithful and Fallen series. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read Fruits Basket Volume 4 by Natsuki Takaya. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Carpe Corpus by Rachel Kane, the 6th book in the Morganville Vampire series. I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read Culti by Mariana Zapata. This is a standalone book. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Valhalla, The Collected Saga Volume 2, featuring stories 4, 5, and 6. This I gave 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read Swept Away by Robin Carr. This is a standalone book. I gave this one 2 out of 5 stars. Then I read Speed Reading, A Complete Guide by, I forgot the author. I gave this one 2 out of 5 stars. Then I read An Extraordinary Union by Alyssa Cole. This I gave 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. I gave this one 3 stars. Then I read Full Metal Alchemist Volume 5 by Hiromu Arakawa. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. Next I read Fortune's Pawn by Rachel Bach, the first book in the Paradox trilogy. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Walking Dead Volume 3 by Robert Kirkman and Charlie Adlard. I gave this one 2.5 stars. Then I read The Night of the Dragon by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. This is the second book in the first companion of the Dragonlance Chronicles. I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read Witchmark by C.L. Polk. This is the first one in a series, I believe. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Next up, I read Night Shift by Stephen King. This is a short story collection, the first one he did. I gave this one an overall of 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read Bad Unicorn by Platt F. Clark. This is the first book in the Bad Unicorn trilogy. I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. Next book I read was Reaper Man by Terry Pratchett, the 11th book set in the Discworld, and this is the second book set in the Death series. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Summer of Jordi Perez by Amy Spalding. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Then I read A Mistake, A Prince and Pregnancy by Macy Yates. I gave this one 2 stars. The next one I read was Bravest Warriors Volume 1 by Joey Comer. I gave this one 3 stars. Then I read Shadow Me by Tahira Mafri. I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read Lumberjanes Volume 1 by Noel Stevenson and a bunch of others. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. Next up I read Bobby Sky, Boy Band or Die by Joe Shine. I gave this one 2 out of 5 stars. Next up I read Dødens Terning or The Die of Death by Kenneth Bøgh Andersen, the second book in the Great Devil War series. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. Next I read Taste of Marrow by Sarah Gailey, the second book in the River of Teeth duology. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next up I read Hidden Magic by Ashley Mayra. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Next I read First Frost by Jennifer Estep, the 0.5 of the Mythos Academy. I gave this one 4 stars. Then I read Allegedly by Tiffany D. Jackson. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Then I read Half-Blood Dragon by K.N. Lee. This is the first one in a series. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Next up I read Full Metal Alchemist Volume 6 by Hiromu Arakawa. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read Fruits Basket Volume 5 by Natsuki Takaya. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Hex by Thomas Oldhøyveld. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Then I read Fruits Basket Volume 6 by Natsuki Takaya. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next up I read My Plain Jane by Cynthia Han, Brody Aston and Jodie Meadows. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Next up I read The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next up I read Side Jobs. There's stories from the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. This is a short story collection set in the Dresden Files. You have to read after the 12th book. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read City of Dragons by Robin Hobb, the third book in the Rainwild Chronicles. I gave this one 4.5 out of 5 stars. Then I read Beartown or Bjørneby by Frederick Backman. This is the first book in the Beartown duology. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read The School for Good and Evil by Suman Chanani. This is the first book in the School for Good and Evil trilogy, or quartet now, I think. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Next I read Treasure of the Abyss by Tiffany Roberts. I gave this one, this is the first book in the series. I think it's called the Kraken series. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Red Magician by Lisa Goldstein. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Firestarter by Stephen King. This I gave 3.5 stars. Next up I read Red Fox by Karina Halle, the second book in the Experiment in Terror series. I gave this one 2 out of 5 stars. Next up I read Dracula by Bram Stoker. This is a classic obviously. I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. Next up I read Wildfire by Ilona Andrews. This is the third and final book in the Hidden Legacy series. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. Next up I read Valhalla the Collected Saga Volume 3 by Peter Madsen. I gave this one 3 stars. Next up, I read Gunner Creek Court by Thomas Siddle. This is the first volume in the Gunner Creek Court series. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read The Silence of the Lamb by Thomas Harris, the second book in the Hannibal Lecter series. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Murder on Astor Place by Victoria Thompson. This is the first book set in the Gaslight mystery series. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Life After Life by Kate Atkinson. This is the first book, I think, in the Todd duology. I gave this one 2 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Wolves in Winter by Tyrell Johnson. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Frostburn by Patricia Briggs, the 7th book in the Mercy Thompson series. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read 9 Princes in Amber by Roger Zelazny. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read An Unkindness of Ghosts by River Solomon. I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read Lumberjanes Volume 2 by Noel Stevenson and others. I gave this one 4.5 stars. Then I read City of Lies by Sam Hawke. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Dead Zone by Stephen King. I gave this one 4.5 stars. Then I read The Viscount Who Loved Me by Julia Quinn. This is the second book in the Bridgerton series. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Artificial Condition by Martha Wells, the second book in the Murderbot Diaries. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Then I read No Time Like the Past by Jodie Taylor, the 5th book set in the Chronicles of St. Mary series. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Then I read The Exercise of Vital Powers by Ian Gregoire, the first book in a series called Legend of the Order. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Next up, I read Uprooted by Naomi Novik. This is a standalone book. I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read Screwdriver by Alice Clayton, the 3rd book set in the Cocktail series. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Then I read Road Work by Richard Bachman, also known as Stephen King. I gave this one 2 out of 5 stars. Then I read Midnight Frost by Jennifer Estep, the 5th book set in the Mythos Academy. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Rose and the Dagger by Renee Ahdieh. This is the second book in the Wrath and the Dawn duology. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Feathers by Jorge Corona. I don't know if that's pronounced correctly. I gave this one 2.5 stars. Then I read Sea of Rust by C. Robert Cargill, and I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read Wondersmith, The Calling of Morrigan Crow by Jessica Townsend, the second book in the Nevermore series. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. The next one I read was Witches Abroad by Tara Pratchett, the 12th book set in the Discworld, and this is the 3rd book set in the Witches series. I gave this one 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read Blood of Dragons by Robin Hobb, the 4th and final book in the Rainwild Chronicles. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. The next one I read was I've Got You Under My Skin by Mary Higgins Clark. This is the first book in the Under Suspicion series. I gave this one 2.5 stars. Then I read The Tropic of Serpents by Maria Brennan, the second book in the Memoirs of Lady Trent series. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Then I read Lady Castle by Delilah S. Dawson and others. I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read The Sign of 4 by Arthur Conan Doyle, the second book in the Sherlock Holmes mystery series. I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read Undead Girl Gang by Lily Anderson. This is a standalone book. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. The next one I read was Murder on St. Mark's Place by Victoria Thompson, the second book in the Gaslight mystery series. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read Pelham by L.L. McNeil. This is the second book in the World of Linaria series. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read Sawkill Girls by Claire Legrand. This is a standalone horror book. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read A Virgin River Christmas. This is the fourth book set in the Virgin River series. I gave this one 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read A Feast for Crows by George R.R. Martin, the 4th book set in the Song of Ice and Fire series. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Only Human by Sylvain Neville, the 3rd and final book in the Themis Files series. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. And finally I read Valhalla the Collected Saga Volume 4 by Peter Madsen. This contains 10, 11 and 12. And I gave this one 4.5 out of 5 stars. So these were all the books that I read in 2018. Thank you for watching if you stuck to the end. I'll see you in another video very soon. Bye.